Welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. This is a podcast for male survivors of sexual abuse and assault, whether as a child or as an adult. Know that you are not alone and the abuse was not your fault. My name is Mike Chapman. I'm a certified recovery life coach and also a survivor. Let's find hope and healing together. And welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. Thank you for joining me today. And with me as a guest is Robert Maniscalco. I will introduce him in a moment. And if you would like to join us live, feel free to do so. You can learn more about how to do so on my website, polarlifeconsulting.com/live. And for those who are in the audience, a reminder that you can be as anonymous as you would like. Put your questions or comments in chat, and we will honor anonymity and only state your name if you manually type it in with your comment or question. And with that, let me introduce my guest tonight, Robert Maniscalco, who is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and has been a professional creative his entire adult life. He was born in Detroit and lived in New York, New Orleans, and now is in Charleston, South Carolina. His commission portraits and fine art are part of over 1,000 collections throughout North America, and he hosted the Art Beat program on a local PBS station and also founded the Maniscalco Gallery. And he likes to work in multiple series. He has been commissioned a portrait artist, immortalizing Supreme Court justices as well as children and families. And I will list all of these wonderful projects in the show notes. And he has expanded his creative milieu to include courtroom sketching, covering different trials in the Charleston area. And he has done lots of other stuff as well, and I will have him share some of that. And links to a lot of his stuff will be in the show notes as well. So, to start things off, we are going to start like we do most weeks with 4 questions. Now it's time for 4 questions, that part of the podcast when we get to know our guest a bit better by asking a few questions. Let's go. So, Robert, what is your favorite food memory?
Okay, so my favorite food memory was my dad making spaghetti when I was a kid in big vats and it's boiling over and flopping all over the stove and then him putting it into cans after it was cooked to store it in the freezer. Years later we realized we were, like razor thin close to botulism, but thank God we never got botulism. But I do remember that his spaghetti is as opposed to mom's spaghetti, which is M&M's line. But my dad's spaghetti, yeah, he raised me. Basically, he raised me when I was, since I was a little kid. Gotcha. Mom was not around most of the time, so I have a lot of memories with him, and the spaghetti is one of them.
Wow. So, what is your favorite Christmas or holiday memory?
Oh, Christmas time. Let's see. Of course, when I was a little kid, I remember my father was making a movie, 16 millimeter movie about painting a portrait, and he would paint one frame at a time and click the camera and then do another one, get a little string and pull it, click the camera, click every frame. So it ended up being like a half an hour movie, which of course has since died or disintegrated, unfortunately.
Right.
This fantastic movie that was sort of cutting edge. It was like a demonstration of how to paint a portrait. Not related, other than to say that he had leftover film, and he filmed my 6th Christmas, and I'm the day after Christmas, so it was birthday Christmas for me.
Wow.
Yeah, so on Christmas, there's film of me, and I remember being in this, running toward the tree and seeing my Stingray bike, and jumping on it, picking it up, and having so much fun, and just that pureness, that innocence, that feeling of I had everything I wanted in that moment. I think we all have those moments where we just felt like everything made sense. So
right.
that's when I was 6.
Wow. Yeah. Excellent. Now, what is your favorite church or house of worship memory?
Okay, so my brother went and got saved at the local Pentecostal church, and
Hmm.
my father was an agnostic, and so this upended everything. And so I went and got saved myself with my neighbors who were trying to rescue us because it was kind of chaotic. My father was raising
Right.
4 kids himself. My mom was sort of a weekend mom. We'd see her, but she wasn't really part of the whole growing up thing for me as I remember it. And so he was very down on this whole idea. He thought it was all religious cult and crazy people and all that sort of stuff, that, religion was a bunch of hooey. So my neighbors took it upon themselves to take me to a Jack Van Impe. They had a big revival or something going on.
Jack Van Impe, that's right. Yes, I've heard of him. Yes.
Yeah, and with all the quotes and his wife, and it's crazy. When you look at his stuff on TV, it was kind of insane. But it made a lot of sense to me, and it spoke to me, and it sort of laid the foundation for my Christian coming back to Jesus moment. Years later when I got married in 12 years ago, 14 years ago now. But so I went to this Pentecostal church after that with my brother. Everyone was speaking in tongues.
Right.
I was looking around, and I really wanted to be like everybody else and speak in tongues. And I just remember, this wasn't in the church, but I just remember being on my living room floor. Maybe now I'm 12 years old, I'm alone in the house, and I said, God, I'm not going to move. I'm not going anywhere until you give me the baptism of the Holy Spirit. I was waiting for the skies to open up, and guess what? They didn't.
Yeah.
God is not a short order cook, and he doesn't come when you want. He comes when he wants.
Right.
And so anyway, I just remember that moment of feeling like alone,
Hmm.
what that felt like, to be what I felt like was abandoned. I learned eventually that it was just God's timing, not mine, that I
Right.
had to be aware of. And I've become more aware of that, obviously, as things have gone on in life, and I'm now 65. So that's it. That's all I
So
can give
what
you.
what
Go
about
ahead.
that makes it your favorite church memory?
I guess it wasn't a favorite church memory. Yeah.
Just a strong church memory.
I went dark. Yes, a church memory. Well, the church memory of, I guess, the Jack Van Impe would have to be the most
Yeah.
moving emotional experience when I actually got saved, and I
Right.
felt at that moment really connected. There's that euphoria that you can
Right.
only you can't really describe it to anybody when God enters your spirit and you feel like someone is with you. That was a tremendous rush, and
Absolutely.
it stayed with me all my life. So
Right.
my wife, I was what I was calling myself 14 years ago when we met. My second wife, I'll tell you about her later, but she was certain that Christ was in me, and she wouldn't have married me if she thought otherwise, even though I was practicing secular humanism,
Right.
just being a good person, because I had felt let down and betrayed by authority, particularly in this church. I'll tell you about that later, as it comes up.
What is your favorite scripture or any inspirational quote that has helped you on your spiritual journey? And what about it speaks to you?
Okay, well, something that I kind of live by, that's helped me a lot, as I have had many chapters in my life, many different times and things that I was doing, and like I was a musician and I was going to be a classical musician, and I technically failed to do that because at the height of my talents and training, I quit very dramatically. And I lived with that failure and many others along the way that I've carried around and dragged behind me. And then I do a lot of writing and a lot of figuring, and I think of writing as like a mathematical equation. And this equation came to me: you can only fail when you stop trying. I don't think I made that up, but it's something I've kind of lived by. And it's just to say, like, music was not something I failed at. It was just simply I stopped doing. And why did I stop doing it? Well, in retrospect, I can say I didn't want to spend the rest of my life with a clarinet shoved in my mouth
Right.
and playing, music. I had other things I had to say, I had to do, write. I became an actor. So it was my first love just wasn't serving me. So as I've kind of been more philosophical about these things that have come and gone in my life, and rather than thinking of them as failures, I just think of them as a curtain closing and another curtain rising. They're not failures. They're just that's just not working for me. I'm going in another direction now, and I've changed directions many times, as we all have to. When you stop trying, you can mark it down as a failure, or you can just say, oh, I'm not interested in trying that anymore. I'm trying something else. We have goals, right? We put goals in front of us. We say, I'm going to do this in the next 5 years. I want to be blah, 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 whatever. And they have to be in flux. You have to be flexible with those things because they change as your desires change, needs change.
Absolutely. And now let's segue into your story. I know for a lot of survivors, our stories jump all over the timeline as things disclose and so forth, and different things happen. So start wherever you need to and share as much as you're comfortable sharing. I will probably interrupt here and there with questions or comments. Then after your story, then I would like to talk about your healing journey, what you've done to help yourself heal, what you've tried that has worked, and what you've tried that has not worked for you. And then from there, move on to what you're doing these days. And I know you're doing a lot, which sounds wonderful. All kinds of artistic endeavors, and we'll talk about that and other things as well. And somewhere in there, we're going to talk about Oprah and your experience on her show as well.
I guess that has become part of my story in a way.
Absolutely.
Because that was the first time I actually had met face to face other men who had survived, and there were 200 of us in that room.
Yes.
So it was pretty eye-opening for me because I'm sure I had met other men who had been survivors of a sexual assault, but I didn't know who they were. They're anonymous. They're among us. They live among us, but we don't know who they are.
Right. 1 in 6 for sure.
Yeah.
But most don't disclose.
Right. Or even think of it as abuse.
Right. Exactly. They don't have the language.
So my story, and I have to start by saying I just did over the last couple of years EMDR therapy.
Right.
Where I was telling the story over and over again with this rapid eye movement thing. So it was interesting just to tell the story. And then before that, I did a year of exposure therapy, which was interesting because I, again, had to tell the story in a very comfortable place. So now when I tell the story, it's much more easy. I know immediately to go into a relaxed state and to try to find things that are soothing to me as I tell this story. And the reason I mention this before I even start is, again, this should be somewhat instructive. There are people at various stages, I'm sure, listening to this in their healing. One of them is learning how to tell your story and not let it freak you out. And that's not easy. So repetition is the key, and comforting yourself. So as I tell this story, I'm going to be comforting myself and trying to relax and breathe. So my story is this. I guess you could say abandoned by my mother at 9 months in the crib. And I had vivid memories of being in this crib and feeling that abandonment, feeling alone, that no 9-month-old should ever feel. So there was that. The house, as I mentioned earlier, was chaotic. Growing up with my father, he didn't know how to run a house, and the only woman in the house was my sister, and she was not equipped to be the mother of the house, the woman of the house.
And were you the youngest of you said 4 children?
Yes, so I was the youngest of 4 children.
Youngest, okay.
Yeah.
Another baby in the family. I was the youngest of 3.
Oh, yeah. We're the sweet ones, and there's all these things about the youngest, but yeah. What it worked out to be is that I was the one that spent most of my childhood among my peers, my siblings, more time away from my mother than they had. They had more of a relationship with her than I was able to have. But I did see her on weekends and whatnot. And so through this chaos and this lack of foundational or moral center, or, there wasn't anything like that. My father was very verbally abusive, very quick to anger, and I found out later he was like the second round of the Normandy invasion, and he had all this trauma from that, and that was coming out all the time, anger. So there was setup, for me of kind of a desire looking for someone to acknowledge me, appreciate who I was, and what that means. Set up perfectly for someone to groom me. And certainly someone came along who saw the opportunity, with a doctor of radiology at Children's Hospital in Detroit, started dating my sister and became very interested when she talked about her little brother, wanted to meet me. And he took me under his wing and just started telling me all the things that I'd been longing to hear, that I was talented, that I was special, and that I had a purpose in the world, and that I could do anything I want. And he made me feel like I was worth something, whereas it didn't get that kind of feeling when I was growing up. He kind of became part of the family, saying prayers, family dinners, and a lot of my brothers and sisters were sort of dubious of him, but I thought it was great that he loved me. He thought I was so special. So he just did a fantastic job of grooming me.
Right.
And so I wrote a poem called Destroyer from his perspective, from the perspective of the abuser, because I needed to explore that. How did he do this? What did he tap into? And I kind of touched on it a little bit. But so he arranged for us to have a boys' weekend, a men's weekend, whatever you want to call it. And I didn't know what to expect. Maybe some voice in my head kind of knew something was up. I didn't expect what did actually happen. He took me to an Italian restaurant, which I actually went and visited just before it closed in Detroit, maybe a couple of years ago, just to sort of kind of do some recon.
Right.
And anyway, interestingly, he's a doctor, right? So he orders wine, and they said, "Well, sir, we can't serve." He's a minor. He said, "Well, I'm a doctor." I say, "It's okay, it's okay." And he asserted his authority over and over and over again to others and to me. He was kind, obviously, to me, and deferential, etc., because he wanted me to be vulnerable. So anyway, but I watched him, how he handled all these other people, and wow, I was like, wow, he really is fighting for me, really. Anyway, so what happened then was we went back to his apartment, and I remember walking into his apartment, and I turned around and he was at the door, and he had a deadbolt with a key.
Hmm.
And I was like, huh. And he put the key in his pocket. That was the end of that. And I didn't think about, I don't know what it was, but it's interesting what happens to a person when they're in that situation. I didn't feel like there were a lot of options other than just to kind of be where I'm at and hope to God it was just going to be a friendly, nice hanging out, playing cards or whatever. But it didn't turn out that way. We pulled out some weed, we're smoking some weed, me for the first time. And I'm like, wow, this is really amazing. So, and it wasn't long before he was taking my shirt off, and eventually clothes came off. And at some point I literally had, well, it's called dissociation, but
Right.
to me, I always thought of it as an out-of-body experience, because that's what it literally felt like. I left my body. I said, this is not where I want to be right now, because things were happening to me that I didn't understand. He was performing fellatio, and then penetrated me, and it hurt. I didn't know what to do. I was helpless. The feeling,
Right.
of course.
Right.
I'd like to hear your story sometime, Mike, but it's terrible to be in that situation. Like I said, I was looking at it from the ceiling. I was literally floating above my body, and just went away.
Right.
And afterwards, I kind of wriggled away and went into the bathroom, and I just didn't know what to do. I don't know what happened exactly after that, or how the rest of the night went. I just remember having been violated in that way and didn't want to upset him. And then he started talking to the walls and talking about how he has a relationship with the Pope, and he can do anything he wants. He can call up whoever he needs. And he started, because he didn't get exactly the response he wanted from me. So he started going into this kind of what seemed quite a bit like psychopath mode. And then I started to be kind of afraid for my well-being, whether I'd make it out of this alive at some point.
Right.
Because, I don't remember sleeping or how that happened. I guess I must have passed out from the weed or whatever at some point. And I did eventually get taken home, and I was told not to say a word about this to anyone, which I didn't. I didn't say a word to anyone about anything. I just became completely mute for a whole week. I went through life kind of a zombie and people would talk to me, and I didn't say anything. My brother finally realized something was going on. He got me to tell him, and then I told my father, and my father immediately marches us over to this guy's house. And meanwhile, he's calling me every night. This abuser, this perpetrator, calling me and threatening me. Don't tell anybody.
Right. It sounds like that initial reaction, you were actually in shock. That's your body's responding to trauma. So that's this trauma response that you had, that you were in shock because of what happened. So yeah, that zombie demeanor, that's would be a normal response for that for sure. Yes.
Yes, it turned into PTSD, and it's something I've been dealing with all my life is the PTSD from that shock, from that dissociation. It does something to your mind to leave your body like that, to just
Right.
literally want to abandon shit, because
Right.
that's what I kind of wanted to do. And so, eventually my father got me to tell him, and I didn't tell him at that time the full extent of what had happened.
Hmm.
It was terrifying to be locked in a room like that. I pat myself on the back for surviving, literally, for not doing anything to provoke what might have been a very different set of events by just going along or whatever. So there was weeks of him calling on my phone every night. I had my own phone for some reason, and he'd call and threaten me if I told anybody, and I said, please stop calling me, and my father didn't understand. Maybe he could disconnect the phone. I don't know how he was able to have access to me for weeks, months after this, even after my father showed up with my sister and me to his apartment. I'm sort of re-traumatized being in this apartment with my family.
Right.
And he's in the kitchen threatening me with his mouth, like, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you.
Wow.
I'm like, Dad, he's talking to me, and my father, here's the pisser, where the authorities in my life were supposed to step up, right? You think, oh, he's taking action. He's going to take this guy. And this guy works at Children's Hospital. My father's a portrait painter, and he wants to get the portrait of the head of the Children's Hospital. He's working on
Hmm.
doing that. And he doesn't want anything to upend or jeopardize that opportunity for him. So he just takes it upon himself. He says, you don't want to prosecute this or do anything. Let's just let this go. And I'm like, okay, whatever you think is best, right? I wasn't in any position to assert anything because I was
Right.
like in shock, as you say. So he just let this go, let this guy off scot free.
Mm.
And he went on to God knows what, to continue to perpetrate other situations, and finding as a doctor at a children's hospital. I
Right.
mean, you talk about fair game, or it was, and so part of what re-traumatized me or kept me in this state was, oh my God, I could have stopped him. I could have stopped this. Who knows what he did after this, right? He went, we just let him go. He just slipped away. And, years later as an adult, I tried to locate him. I tried to find him to try
Right.
to maybe prosecute or do something. And he was long gone, and I don't know where he was from. Brazil originally, where men treat men other ways, and he had an accent, and he had a very smooth talking explanation for how things were between a man and a boy.
Hmm.
Anyway, so this story goes in my 20s, 30s. I'm getting therapy, trying like crazy to get a handle on this. Meanwhile, having relationships and making messes of things. Thank God I didn't do any pedophilia or anything like that. I didn't have that inclination. But without treatment, without some kind of intervention, without the things that we have available today, I could have been any number of things. But as it was, I was not terribly ethical in relationships, and I would say I was a womanizer, and sometimes come back to haunt me. Some relationships where I didn't even remember, that I had done something bad,
Right.
like in a play, groped a woman, thinking it was just in fun, just boundaries. Didn't understand that there was no word for boundaries in the
Right.
80s and 90s. There just wasn't a word for any of these things. I didn't understand what those were. So I just felt like I could do whatever I wanted.
And you were not shown boundaries because of what had happened.
As far as authority goes, I went to the church, my pastor, my Pentecostal pastor, Lucille Deal, and I said, this happened to me, and she just stopped talking to me, didn't want anything to do with me. I'm like, why? I was ostracized from the church.
Hmm.
I'm like, you're supposed to step in and help. And all the people that were supposed to be there for me as a support to prevent it, and then if it happens, God forbid, something like that happens, to try to help you, to support you in some way, even in the crude way that was maybe available in the 90s and 80s, and the 70s, whatever. These were dark times. Back when America was great. Yeah, you could do anything you wanted to and get away with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then the story goes is I started writing a book, and it was sort of a therapeutic exercise. What if I did find this guy and I could confront him? And so I concocted this story based on my past and with a fictionalized future of being able to actually come face to face with this guy with a gun in my hand. What would I do?
Hmm.
So that's what the book is about. I won't tell you what I did because, you can read the book. It's
Read the
called The Fish Fly. And it was my first book, my first novel, a very important book. My
right.
best friend is still trying to put it on an audiobook. Famous actor, friend of mine, Don Harvey.
Okay.
He's been working on it for 20 years. Just can't get it right. The whole thing is in the first person. So it's like one giant monologue.
Right.
So as an actor, to read that book, you have to actually become the character and do the
Right.
whole. So anyway, then it came to here I am in Charleston, years later, and um, I went to a thing called Darkness to Light, which is a preventative organization that tries to prevent child abuse by training people who are in contact with kids, which is a wonderful organization.
Hmm.
I think they've expanded nationally, and I wanted to get involved with it and become a facilitator. And I found that my story kind of interfered with my ability to be a good facilitator because at the time the story would just upend me telling the story. And it wasn't about survival, it was about preventing it from happening. So it's a whole
Right.
different mindset. Anyway, but through them, they hooked me up with the Oprah show, and I ended up going on that Oprah show. They did 2 episodes in 2010
Right.
back to back. Tyler Perry was the main person who came out and talked
Right.
about his abuse, and several of us had little vignettes where we mentioned what had happened, etc.
Were
But
you
we were
featured in a
just
vignette?
I was one of the vignettes in the
Okay.
first episode. I was abused by a doctor, nothing terribly, but taken as a whole, all these vignettes were very
Right.
impactful. It was a very emotional show for everybody. They were passing around Ativans like candy, just for everybody to stay calm. I'm like, what's this? That's an Ativan. Take it. I'm like, I don't know. I'm afraid.
That's funny. Yeah, and you are my second guest who was an alumni of that episode. Michael Skinner was the other. And yeah, his episode posted several weeks ago. Pleased to have him on. But yeah, it's interesting to hear those stories. And that was such a groundbreaking episode. This is pre Me Too. And I think because Tyler Perry shared his story and Oprah was a strong proponent for sexual abuse survivors, but had no idea how many men that issue touched as well, how many male victims of this were out there.
Yeah,
And the fact that they were able to get that whole audience, 200 men,
200 of
and they got your photos ahead of time and you didn't know what they were going to do with them, but then they blew them up. So they were like life-size photos and you could hold them up to camera and
yeah,
everyone could see, okay, you at the age when you were abused
yeah,
and how impactful that was to see on camera.
yeah,
That, yeah, I know I watched it and I was blown away by the impact
yeah.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, her producers really know how to put a show on. That's for
right.
sure. Because that was
Absolutely.
that was maximum impact. And the second episode, which is hard to get to see, they
Right.
got really, really into these stories and much more explicit. And I'm pretty sure most people watching it were like, "That's a thing," like that people didn't know that happened. So it was quite important, I think, for those of us who are male survivors to know that we are not alone. That this happens quite common.
Absolutely. So, how, yeah, let's go into that. How did you feel about now you were asked to go on this thing and you're there? How did you feel leaving it? How did you feel when you were there participating? And then after it Was it live? Was it shown live, or usually they tape it ahead of time, a few days
Yeah,
beforehand?
no, we shot the two episodes back to back, like within an hour of each other.
Right,
So we were just still in the same chairs, and then they did the second they just decided we're going to do a second episode. They just made that decision right there because there was just too much that needed to be covered, and it was that important. And this was back in the peak of the Oprah show. This was like
right,
the last season,
right,
and she was so iconic, a household name. Obviously, still is. So it was pretty gutsy of her to do that, and I commend her for taking that on, because
right.
I know she had been abused as well. So it was something she was. But I don't think she was as familiar with the fact that men were also in this boat
Right.
with her.
Exactly. So you felt like you were not alone because you were in this audience full of other survivors, and
Yes,
that was the first time you had interacted with them, you said?
first time I'd actually spoken with a person who I knew had been. I didn't know we didn't know each other's stories, but we just knew that we all had this one thing in common.
Right.
Some of the stories were so horrific that I got into this. Well, my abuse wasn't as bad as some people who were like captured and held prisoner for months or
Right.
years at a time. I mean,
So
I don't even know your story, Mike.
it's not a contest, and
I
there's all
know
kinds
that's
of
what I had to.
layers
That's where I was
of
going.
abuse.
That's what I was
Uh,
going to. It's like
yeah,
I felt like my abuse really wasn't as important or as good or as big a deal as everyone else's or some of the others. And you're right, it's not a competition. I think it's mostly having to do with how it lands on you and how your body and your psyche experiences whatever that violation that happened to me, the way it was done with the lock, it was earth shattering to me. It was like
right,
there was no security anymore. There was no more innocence. For me, it was a door that closed on my childhood, slammed in my face.
right,
So, I know there are horrific, terrible stories that people have survived with tremendous amount of grace, more grace than I ever had, in terms of my surviving. But again, it's not a competition for how graceful you.
right.
I'm a mess.
Right. Yeah,
So, and
it's all destructive. It is all evil. And even if it happens only one time, it is devastating to the victim. And unless there are certain things, unless it's found out right away and you can get the support you need to heal properly right away, it's devastating. And even if
yeah,
you have all those things,
yes.
it's still devastating. It will much, much lessen the scars, but there still will be scars. And some people get the support right away and they are able to heal pretty early on, but
And
that
others,
is the exception to the rule.
there's this other point, and that's that I want to make is that, some people are sensitive and are more affected by trauma, sexual trauma, maybe war trauma than others. Some people can go through battle and have lose people and see this and they just, it's like, oh yeah, they manage to compartmentalize things in ways that I can't imagine and maybe you can't, but some people can do this, and I don't know what you lose when what you give up by being able to do that. But I didn't want to give up feeling. I didn't want to give up being sensitive, being attuned, being present with where I was at. Because I felt as an artist, I wanted to be honest and I wanted to be authentic in everything that I did. And, all of my dealings with people, I don't suffer fools. I don't like people who are pretentious or bullshit and think they have it all together. Those people bother me in some ways because I just feel like they've given up something else. There's something about being sloppy human, having feelings and making mistakes and saying the wrong thing sometimes, willing to make amends, to clean up our messes, to be have a moral center that I had to find. And Jesus helped, right? And we all have help in finding these things, and it took me a long time to get there. Anyway, so I just wanted to mention that part of it because it's not everybody. Like my brother, I have to mention this. My brother who decided he was a homosexual in his 50s. None of us knew any of this, right? So, but he told me, I wish that had happened to me. I'm like, Jimmy, you don't wish that had happened. I mean, like, he would say that to me, and it was like, drive me crazy. What do you mean you wish that would have happened to you? Like some kind of fantasy he had. It's not the sexual violation, it's the loss of freedom and the fact that I didn't have agency over what I was doing. I wasn't there participating. It wasn't something I was wanting. I didn't expect it. I guess maybe some part of me did, but there was some part of me that was like, this can't be. This can't be the world. This can't be this
Yeah,
kind of a thing can't happen.
your brain was not old enough to process
Yes.
even the fact that you're a sexual being because
Right.
of the age that you experienced it.
Yes. I mean, this is the thing, Jimmy, my brother, if he had experienced that at that age, it would have devastated him. It would have not been, he wasn't able to, whatever, process it and see it. But he would
Hmm.
do that. I think he would just do it to get a rise out of me because he used to love mentioning the abuser's name, Gusto Fernandez, in case anybody runs across a Dr. Gusto Fernandez, Gustavo Fernandez, whose name I can say because I would love it if somebody found him and brought him to justice. Let's put it that way.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah,
So when did you, I mean, you told your father right away, obviously, and
about a week. Yeah,
your sister went with you.
yes,
After that, had they mentioned that, and did you disclose to your other brothers right away what had happened? Your other siblings?
yeah. And my mother, who
Hmm.
in my 40s said, I didn't know you were sodomized. Well, it's kind of, I guess it doesn't matter at this point. Some people knew the story and then just went on to forget it. You know what I'm saying? It,
Right.
it just became not part of, it wasn't a part of who they knew me to be. And I was kind of, for a while there, my identity as a survivor was so intertwined, it was difficult to separate the survivor from the artist, from the man, from the
Right.
lover, from the husband, from the father. And, it's very important to be able to, somehow separate them.
Right. Right. Now, how about telling other people? I know you're married,
Mhm.
married twice. How did that go telling either of those wives about that part of your story? And how was that received?
Well, I mean, girlfriends, everybody. I was very honest, and it was, maybe I would tell it on my second or third date. I mean, I would be maybe a little bit too quick on the gun when it came to telling people the story. I was very, very willing to tell the story. I have a Facebook group that's all about my
Mm,
survivorship,
right.
and I've done some advocacy. I don't know. I try to get on programs like this whenever I can and try to tell the story to try to help others.
So it's very much out there now, yes.
Oh yeah, it's out there, and there's no shame attached to it. The fact that my first wife, for all of her flaws, was understanding of that as well. So I
Right.
can't imagine being in a relationship with somebody who I would be afraid to tell that to. So
Right.
all those kids out there, please, honesty is not a option here. You really have to be, like I said, get good at telling the story. And it's been about a year or so since I actually was in a position to tell the story, so it was a little bit awkward for me. You have to practice telling the story. You have to practice being okay with that's what happened. That's part of who I am. It's part of what makes me the awesome person that I am, that I have survived this, that I have done something, that I have made it.
Right. Absolutely. And you don't necessarily have to tell every single person every single detail of everything that
Right.
happened.
No.
You can pick and choose, you can lessen it, you can euphemize it, whatever you need to do to
Yeah.
make it palatable. And I know for many of us, for disclosure, especially when we're not out there, you kind of disclose in pieces and you give them little nuggets of
Yes.
truth, see how they handle it. It's like, oh, you're handling it well. Okay, well, I'll give you a little bigger chunk and then a little
Yeah.
bigger chunk. Won't necessarily give you the whole big messy pile, but enough of it so you can see what's going on.
I have relationships with people, friends, whatever, who don't even know a baby. I don't even, because it just hasn't come up in a conversation. And that's okay too. It doesn't have to be a part of every relationship. I'm releasing these little comedy bits. I'll send you the one I'm talking about where, I talk about, and I'm trying to kind of frame it with a little bit of humor, the abuse. Again, this is all part of a healing process. It's something we talked about, wanted to talk about. But for me, the creative, writing that book was a healing process for me. what would I do if I had him at the end of a gun barrel? And, thank you for not asking. But I'm not going to tell you. You got to read the book.
For sure. And let's talk about your healing journey. You mentioned you've done EMDR, exposure therapy, plus just your expansive repertoire of creative endeavors. I know that, and I've said this on the podcast before, that any kind of creative process, poetry, art, writing, music, it's a very right brain activity. And a lot of your trauma is also stored in the right brain.
Yes.
So, doing anything artistic can help you process all of those traumas and get them out in a deeper way
Mm-hmm.
than traditional therapy might offer.
Yeah,
So,
you're
I look forward
literally
to that.
putting them
Yes.
out. You're literally transmitting this evil out of your body into a pen at the end of a pencil or a paintbrush or whatever, and you're literally putting it. Here's a book that has that in it. It's out there. So the more you can let that kind of thing go and express it in different ways and different modes. Like I said, I'm doing comedy now, so it's an ongoing journey. Like you said, I did the EMDR and exposure therapy most recently, but I did primal therapy back in the 90s.
Hmm.
If
What is
anybody,
primal therapy?
yeah, if they don't know what primal therapy is, it's been discontinued because the
Too primal.
it's like this is not really helpful. They found out, but at the time it seemed like it was a really good thing. They were doing this in New York City,
Right.
and I went to this place where they were doing it. Anyway, it was you basically in a circle, and the therapist is like, "Okay, your turn, Rob. We're going to talk about your experience, your thought. What are you feeling like? Oh, I wish I could. I want to I just hate this person. Okay, put that person right in this mattress. I want you to put him right. And I want you to say, fuck you, I'm good enough. I'm like, fuck you, I'm good enough. Fuck you, I'm good enough. Escalate. No, more, Rob, more. And to the point where, here, Rob. And they gave me a bank and a bed mattress against the wall. And they said, go get him, Rob. And I just like, fuck yeah. I'm good. Screaming at the top of my lungs, blood curdling, tears
Hmm.
splattering everywhere, just losing my mind. I didn't know who I was or what was what. You're talking about right brain. I didn't know the name of any. It was primal. I literally had a primal experience, and it was quite liberating. The
Right.
the
And actually,
flaw.
so that whole concept is still used today in different support groups, different retreats, and so forth,
Uh-huh.
therapeutic, because getting in touch with your emotions and anger is a huge one.
Yes.
Getting that out. And the same concept of rage rooms that they have, where they
Right.
give you safety goggles and
Uh-huh.
a bat, and they've set up this whole space where you can smash whatever you need to
And we
because
went
it
there
gets
with
it
us.
out.
My family took me. I took my family there for one of their birthdays. One of my kids, my teenage kids, and we
Yeah.
went. We all went to town. And
Yeah, and it's so therapeutic because it's a safe release of anger. And so many of us survivors have that pent up anger, and I facilitate that in some of these retreats that I'm
okay, well, it's
involved with.
interesting because a lot of the mainstream therapeutic practice of psychology today, whatever, they've been shying away from getting people into that angry state because it actually teaches your body to use or to experience anger. So there's a danger in doing too much of that where it becomes like a way of processing it that you might, do in a not safe place, in a not safe way. And so there's a danger
Well,
with that.
they really frame it that yes, this is a safe place, safe
Yeah.
space. You don't be, you're not taking a bat to your kids or your dog or your wife,
Yeah.
but this is a safe place where you can
Yeah.
process those feelings, and we get right to those feelings and make sure that yeah, it's a safe space where you can process them.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
with the caveat that this is not something you want to try at home or to do in a situation where you wouldn't be in control.
Right. Exactly.
But like I say, the concern that people had with primal therapy was, why they stopped doing it. At least where I'm my path, it's just because it was you know, you're training your brain to be angry. I don't know if
Right.
that's possible, but I suppose it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So what other things have you tried that have been helpful or not so helpful?
Well, talk therapy has been very helpful. I went with a psychologist who I finally went and got psychological testing around the time I did Oprah. I finally just said, I've been kind of diagnosing myself. I thought, oh, I think I had two. My grandparents committed suicide, and I think they were bipolar. Oh, yeah, bipolar? You're bipolar? I mean, I literally had a psychiatrist say, within 10 minutes, I said, I think I'm bipolar. And he was into his cabinet pulling out medications for me that he wanted me to take. And I'm like, I don't, was I bipolar? I wasn't, because I did psychological testing in 2010 because I wanted to get to the bottom of it. And I really highly recommend this to anybody that's serious about trying to get to the bottom of this therapeutic process, this healing process, to get a full battery of, it's a whole day of tests, and you're filling this out, filling that out, and they come back and they run it through a computer and they spit it out and they said, okay, you don't have bipolar, you have depression and anxiety and trauma. You have PTSD and you have spiking in a couple of personality disorders, which are the result of this survival methods that you've used, understandably, to survive this horrific feeling of alienation and disconnect. Yeah, trauma responses. So I had a little bit of borderline, like number one. It wasn't five. I wasn't full blown. But they found this all by testing me.
Right.
And then you can design a treatment for that. Of course, there's no medication that can do anything about your personality disorders. The only way to get through them, which is what I did, I went through every aspect of borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and I went through all of the various things. How am I abusing other people? How am I thinking that I'm right all the time? How am I catastrophizing? How does this show up in my life? And I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote about each of these aspects of it. And what could I do differently? How could I do it differently? How could I change this? When I have this feeling, what could I say to myself? Affirmation or a statement that I could say to correct me, to get me back on. Anyway, I did this for 2 years of intensive therapy with this Gordon Teichner here in Charleston.
Hmm.
And at the end of it, we were like, we wanted to write a book because I took the test again, and without trying to rig it or anything like that, I took the same tests, and I was not spiking anymore in those areas. I literally had reduced those thought processes. I literally changed them through sheer will and diligence. Because I'm pretty sure, and this is, if you have a decent IQ, if you're not completely, I mean, really, if you're not intellectually impaired, there's no reason why you can't reason your way in this process. It's grueling, but to really go deep and to really ask the questions and answer them and really grapple with them. It's hard work, but you can move the dial on these personality disorders. They're not life sentences.
How you are responding to the trauma and unpacking those things and learning how you respond in unhealthy ways can help you realize, yeah, we can find healthier ways to respond, or train your brain to realize, okay, I'm not in trauma, I'm not in danger. So
Right.
we can turn off some of those things like the hypervigilance and so
Yes,
forth that so many survivors experience.
exactly. And
Yes,
a lot of people with these borderline and narcissistic personalities have, that's one of the features is the hypervigilance, and how can I turn that down?
right.
So yeah, it's been quite a process. But like I said, at the end of the day, he wanted to write a book with me, and you know how things like that they get pushed aside and forgotten. But I should look him up and see if he still wants to do that.
Yeah.
Because you have to
So,
have a certain amount of time without being with a patient before you
right.
can.
Absolutely. So, what are the different things you're doing today in your own life? know you said you're on podcasts whenever possible to try to share this message, but you do all this artistic stuff. So tell me more about that.
Okay, so I do commission portraits as my main bread and butter because this is something my
Hmm,
father trained me in. It's interesting because there's a certain depth that I see in people when I paint them, and sometimes even with kids, when I paint children, they're not as innocent as they should be
right.
because I don't see them that way. It's a problem. So I don't do a whole lot of portraits of kids. It's just sort of turned out that way. When I do, they're pretty worldly. They're beautiful portraits. But like I say, I do men. I would use this in any of my marketing. I'm talking to you guys about this because, to be honest with you, I think that kind of comes in all the time. It's constantly informing whatever I'm doing creatively.
Hmm,
I'm looking at a painting right now that I did of me in the shame, the pose in the Final Judgment, where man is naked and ashamed, and I did a whole riff on that as a painting. So I've done some paintings that are trying to deal with abuse more directly. Entropy is another painting where the idea that a person is grown into a tree and become part of nature and things like this. I find poetry has been very helpful to me. So I've just written a book called Chromo Sapient, which features artwork and poetry that I've created
hmm,
together
right,
in a very interesting juxtaposition. Some of them directly related, and some of them are just inspired by.
right,
And then, of course, a book I did, how to paint, how to draw, and the mental uh, escapades of trying to get your mind, your ego out of the way and learning how
right,
to see what's really there. That's a whole thing.
right.
It's a whole process.
Now
So
you mentioned survivors. I know you've done courtroom portraits as
yeah, and
well.
that's pretty interesting. I did the Dylan Roof trial. This is the most notable. Dylan Roof was the guy who killed the 9 church parishioners at the Mother Emanuel Church here in Charleston in 2015. And he had a federal trial. And of course, federal courts don't allow cameras in. So I was the
Right,
only eyes of what was going on in this trial. And drawing all these people telling their testimony of how they watched Dylan Roof walk in and shooting all this horrible FBI, every file, or this bullet went in there. And
right,
they just went into such great detail. And the stories were so unbelievable, talk about trauma.
right,
And I'm weeping into my pastel drawings, right? Because it's like triggering a lot of my own feelings of that feeling of hopelessness and terrible, those terrifying feelings, the common to most survivors of any kind of trauma. So I was, triggered. So that the Washington Post wrote an article, and they said at the end of the article about the Dylan Roof trial, said even the courtroom sketch artist was crying. And they're like
which would have been you.
there are little stains, yeah, little stains in the drawings of where my tears fell as I
Wow.
was drawing. I couldn't even see through my tears to
So
to
what
to
was
do the
what
drawing.
was his story? Did he have an abuse history or what brought him
We
to?
don't know. We don't know exactly what his abuse. They did not get into his story. He was representing himself,
Hmm,
and this was his death penalty trial in
right,
the federal courts. And so he did not present a case of defense other than his reading of his manifesto, which was all right wing, uh,
hmm.
taking over the
So he
country, and
didn't
we have to
offer
take back
a
the
defense, right?
because he was a white supremacist, and he was there to
Mm, wow,
to start a race war. That was his
right,
goal. He was a pretty big nut job, as you might expect. But interestingly, a year or two later, I was presenting the sketches at an art exhibition that I was in, and a friend of mine. She's no longer a friend of mine, but because we had a little bit of a falling out, because I couldn't understand why on earth she was actually visiting Dylan Roof in prison and talking to him and trying to minister to him because everybody was trying to get him to turn to Jesus in the trial. They were all like, oh, "We forgive you. We forgive." So there were
hmm,
people who, big. It was a big deal. These people who lost their loved ones were we're forgiving him.
Right.
And, he was not even looking at them. He couldn't give them the time of day, could care less. But she was dead set on trying to redeem him, trying to get him to see Jesus.
Right.
Anyway, he's still on death row. Biden didn't pardon him,
Right.
or there were a few others that he didn't, but his big pardons that he did.
Right.
It's all kind of mixed together, but I
Right.
don't know if we wanted to go there. But you mentioned the courtroom sketching, and it's a very important part of my story, my milieu, as you say.
Right. Absolutely. Wow. Fascinating. And we'll definitely have links in the show notes to all of your stuff that you want to share. And yeah, I've Googled you and tons of your portraits show up. And
Yeah.
yeah, very, very fascinating. So, any final thoughts for that listener out there who's a survivor and listening to your story? What final thoughts would you like to share?
I picture somebody out there who's just sort of putting feelers out and just at the early stages of trying to find the answers. I may not be someone. Maybe people here and your listeners that have probably already gone through quite a process, and that's why they're here to try to keep themselves connected and to try to keep moving that dial. But someone is out there who is reluctant to talk to people, just to stop fighting, stop trying to push people away, let people in. And yeah, you'll get hurt and they will betray you, and there'll be more and others. And the more you open your heart to people, whoever that is, it's a girlfriend or a mother or just someone you meet on the street, just be willing to open your heart. And you never know who you might help. It's not just
Hmm.
about your health, it's about what you might be able to do for someone else inadvertently.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
that's what I would want to convey to your listeners.
Right. Well, that's the theme of the podcast is power of story. That
Yeah.
if you can find a way to get your story out, it helps your healing process. It gets it out of your head. And even if you do it anonymously, that if it's somewhere someone can see it or read it or hear it, they can get inspired to get help from your story. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not only to help you heal, but you can inspire the next person so that they know they are not alone and they can find healing as well.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's how I started working on things. And I think that's part of so many stories that you hear somebody else share, you realize you're not alone
Mm.
and you get the help that you need. And that's story after story that I hear that people come on the podcast and share. Yeah, that they hear other survivors out there, especially men, because we as a whole don't talk about this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So it's even more important and more powerful, the ones that do for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, hopefully something that was said in this might have helped somebody somewhere. That's what we're hoping for, right?
Yes, absolutely. And with that, we'll see you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. If you would like to learn more about my coaching with Polar Live Consulting, where I provide one-on-one coaching and group coaching, both with a focus on healing for male survivors, reach out to me at polarliveconsulting.com. That is Polar spelled Polar. I would love to hear from you. I want to hear your story. If you would like your story featured on this podcast, contact me via my website. If you like this podcast, please rate and review because that's how other people can find me, and I really want to spread this message of healing and hope to others. And remember, you are not alone. Healing is possible, and the abuse was not your fault. Let me repeat that. The abuse was not your fault. See you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast.